I'm Marianne Mason. I'm a local records archivist here at the Library of Virginia, and I'd like to welcome you all to our webinar, Coming Together Through Archives, Archiving Underrepresented Virginia History. This is part of our Archives Month event series, and for those who are not in the know, October is National Archives Month and serves as a period of education and outreach where archivists across the country highlight the importance of the work we do and the archival material we care for. And in fact, as it would happen, and we didn't actually plan this, but today is also National Ask an Archivist Day, which is perfect because that is what we will be doing for about an hour tonight. And so just in general, you can access more information about Archives Month events going on, not just at the Library of Virginia, but across the state on our Virginia Archives Month webpage. You can also access our informational resources and other fun things and activities as well on our webpage. So please check it out. And then also, before introducing our moderator, on behalf of the Virginia Archives Month Committee, I'd like to thank Mason Funk and Astra Price and generally the whole Outwords Archives team for reaching out to our group and getting kind of the wheels in motion to make this program even possible. So we really appreciate all of them and their efforts. I'd also like to thank the Library of Virginia for hosting this webinar and the Friends of the State Archives, as well as the Outwords Archives for financially supporting this program. In terms of housekeeping for tonight, this presentation will be recorded and will run an hour, leaving us all with ample time for questions and answers at the end of the session. We will stop the recording at the time of the Q&A, so you don't have to feel weird about having your questions recorded. If you have questions for the panelists during the presentation, please kind of either jot them down or noodle them in your brain and put these in the chat closer to the end of the actual panel discussion so that it helps us kind of keep track of them a little bit better. And then we will also offer a period where you can unmute and ask questions directly. So moving to the main events tonight, I'd now like to introduce our incredible moderator for the evening, Blake McDonald. Blake is a native of Albemarle County and now resides in Richmond. Blake studied architectural history at Connecticut College and the University of Virginia. As the grants and survey specialist for the Virginia Department of Historic Resources, he travels throughout the Commonwealth supporting the stewardship of Virginia's diverse past. Prior to joining the department in 2015, Blake worked in cultural resource management, historic preservation advocacy, and museum education. So I'm going to turn it over to Blake now to get things going.
Great. Thank you so much, Marianne. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I'm an architectural historian, so I get to spend a lot of time in archives, and I look upon the work that archivists do with a lot of awe. And I know that the conversation tonight is going to really dig into that. So I'm thrilled to be here as well. I'm going to start with some introductions of our panelists, then we'll get right into our questions. So our first panelist, Nix Mendy, is a digital archivist and interviewer for Outwords. In their career, they've prioritized collection processing focused roles, notably interning at the Notarial Archives Research Center before working at Tulane University, Northern Arizona University, and the Chicago Public Library. At Outwords, they conduct oral history interviews with LGBTQ+ elders, collect and manage interviewees' digital photographs, make interviews accessible and discoverable through their website, support external programming, and they previously led the Content Advisory Task Force. They hope to inspire greater self-determination from historically marginalized people by challenging under and misrepresentation in archives. Next, we have Lydia Neuroth. Lydia Neuroth currently serves as the project manager for Virginia Untold, the African American narrative at the Library of Virginia. Virginia Untold provides digital access to records related to enslaved and free Black and multiracial people in the library's collection pre-Civil War. Lydia spent her time in graduate school building tools for researchers specifically around records of slavery, and she's worked at various historic sites researching and interpreting the history of those who were enslaved. Our next panelist is Katie Stueckle. Katie Stueckle has been based in Roanoke, Virginia for the last decade. She graduated from Hollins University in 2020, having studied literature, theater, and environmental science. Since 2021, she has been heavily involved in the Southwest Virginia LGBTQ plus history project, doing everything from leading walking tours to organizing community picnics to conducting and transcribing oral history interviews. In addition to volunteering with the History Project, Katie is also a City of Roanoke artist in residence in charge of running the Daisy Art Parade, the vice president of board of directors for the Donate What You Can nonprofit Ursula's Cafe, and co-founder of the Sapphic Event Group's Second Friday. And our last panelist is Clint Whitten. Clint Whitten, Ph.D., is the Associate Director for the Center for Rural Education at Virginia Tech. His scholarship explores rural education, queer identities, community activism. He is a former middle school English creative writing and theater teacher and the co-editor of the Rural Education and Queer Identities, Rural and Outrooted, which was published in 2025. So we've got our excellent group of panelists. Let's jump into some questions. First, I'm hoping that all of you all, just to sort of place set, can share a little bit about your role in your respective archives and what your work looks like, maybe on a day-to-day or a regular basis. So whoever would like to start, please take it away. And Lydia, I'll just call on you because you're the person who I see on my screen.
Sure, that works. So thanks, Blake, for introducing us. I think when people ask me the question, what do? I tell them I'm an archivist because that gives them the best context maybe for how I spend my time. And I did come to archives through a history background, and I have a professional degree in library science. But as we've referenced earlier, my proper title is project manager for Virginia Untold. And I think maybe the best way to think about what I do is in percentages. So I spend about 70% of my time thinking about the project and managing the work, and then 30% of the time actually doing the work myself. And doing the work myself does look like some pretty traditional archiving responsibilities. So processing original records, organizing them, maybe even some light mending, all to prepare them to be digitized for this Virginia Untold project. That also includes indexing. It includes scanning the records myself. So sitting with a flatbed scanner and digitizing the records, doing the actual image capture. The ingest piece does go to other people in my institution. And then the rest of the time, or probably more of my time these days, is spent thinking really big picture about the project. And that includes supervising people that do the work, so part-time staff, volunteers, interns, communicating with other people in the building. I spend a lot of my time communicating and documenting things. But it also includes promoting the work, thinking about kind of programming and events, outreach, social media, blog posts, tabling at community events, being involved in conversations that are going around about sort of this work, investigating usage statistics and how people are using the project, because I'm thinking about where are there gaps and how are we serving the people that are really using the records? Am I communicating with people in the building to understand that better? That also includes advocating for the work, right? So that includes internally and externally kind of pushing for resources, whether that's staffing or funding. Yeah, so I mentioned that because I think, as we might see with other folks, that a lot of us that are engaged in kind of caring for marginalized histories are both doing the work ourselves and then also thinking about how to move the work forward and like big picture scope goals as well.
That's great. Thanks, Lydia. Nix, you're next on my little bar of folks. Would you like to go?
Sure.
Thanks.
Um, I think my work at Outwards is kind of balanced between, I would say, like doing the work of creating oral histories and then doing the work of managing them. Because I'm an interviewer, I do conduct some oral history interviews, but I'm also like in the background doing like prep interview research, and also conducting prep interviews. I do want to note that part of my work as well as an archivist is not just the management of the oral histories, but also like the creation of them and like the thinking big picture of like what the story is going to be. Um, One of the things that stands out to me about kind of like the prep interview process is really thinking about like what does this person want to talk about? What are they interested in saying about their lives? And what are they maybe not interested in talking about at all? Or things that maybe they've never covered before in an interview or in a public space. So I think it's this balancing act of on the one hand, like making sure that we hit all of the like big picture, really important parts of their lives that I'm sure are represented on the internet or through awards or through whatever sort of accomplishments kind of drew us to them in the beginning, but also thinking about this kind of like dynamic space where they can also share parts of their lives that may be kind of like overlooked because of said accomplishments. So I think it's creating a space in which we kind of try to get the whole of the person. And I think that that's really important to our process. In terms of the archival management, always an advocacy piece around archives. And just doing, I think, some back end work that a lot of people don't necessarily see, but is really important. Um, for example, like if you use the advanced search on our website, like all of the metadata has been basically put together by me and the other archivist. So that's something that I like to tell people is like we are the ones who are deciding like how things get sorted, what the categories are, and how all of these things sort of fit together. And then on top of just kind of like that metadata piece, it's also really thinking deeply about how we can find photographic representation that will show and complement people's oral histories as well. So we collect digital photographs, and by photograph, I don't mean always literal photographs. It can also be copies of ephemera. It can also be copies of objects. But things that capture like who the person is, where they come from, and says something about their story. And so I think one important part of the oral history process is not just the telling of their story through words, but the telling of their story through visual representation, which is something that we also collaborate a lot with our production team around to integrate those things into videos and promotion and social media, newsletter, all those sorts of things. So when I think about my role as an archivist at Outwards, it's kind of this mixed role where we're constantly thinking about how to make our oral histories dynamic, where you're not only getting the experience of getting to hear that person's story in their own words from their own mouth, but also getting new avenues and new ways to sort of see the interconnections between stories across the board. And also kind of like gain this visual representation of what the LGBTQ movement kind of like looks like across the board. So a lot, a lot going on. But I think at the core, it's really thinking about how do we represent the LGBTQ community and how do we advocate for our history moving forward.
Thank you, Nix. I love the idea of a mixed role, and I'm sure that's going to be a theme throughout the conversation, that you're all doing so much, both with the communities you're serving as well as behind the scenes. The work you do reflects some of what the Southwest LGBTQ plus History Project has done. So Katie, would you like to follow up?
Certainly. Hi, everyone. I'm Katie. A little bit about the Southwest Virginia LGBTQ plus history project for context is this project was founded in 2015 in Roanoke, Virginia, as a community-led, volunteer-run history project. So this initiative has always been directed by and led by the people in our community, for the people in our community, and it is very much a public history project. So every time we are thinking about archiving and archives, it goes hand in hand with how are we going to share this information back out and make it public and make it accessible. I joined the Southwest Virginia LGBTQ plus history project in 2021. So approximately halfway through the 10-year life of the project. As of this summer, we have officially gone inactive, concluded our ongoing projects that are all still available on the website, which was just shared in the chat. All of the materials we've digitized, our oral histories that we've collected, which is over 50 from the Southwest Virginia area. All of that information is still available. We are not engaging in any new projects at this time. So I joined about halfway through that 10-year lifespan of the project. I originally started as a walking tour guide, leading walking tours in downtown Roanoke and other Roanoke neighborhoods, based on largely the oral histories and also the archived materials, such as newsletters, library collections, personal photos, things of that nature that we'd collected. That was my introduction, was very much on the public history side. And from there, I became more and more involved in the archiving, including learning how to conduct and transcribe oral histories, building those relationships within our community, helping strategize what groups or individuals to reach out to conduct more oral histories that were perhaps perspectives we had not previously gathered. Learning how to use those materials and stories to then turn around and make that information accessible to our community, whether it's updating walking tours based on newer oral histories that we had gathered, whether it's helping students in Dr. Samantha Rosenthal's classes create podcasts based on those oral histories or conduct more of their own interviews, all the way up to leading gay history bar crawls in downtown Roanoke. So for me, the archiving and role as an archivist always tails with how to make this information accessible, community-oriented, and focused immediately back to the people we have collected it from.
Excellent, thank you. And one of the things that I think is so special about the History Project is that it does shine a light on queer history in rural, small cities, places that often get overlooked in that area of study. And that kind of dovetails nicely into the work that Clint does. So do you want to take it from there, Clint?
Absolutely. Thank you all so much. I'm so honored to be a part of this panel and to get to listen to all of you. And Blake, thank you so much for moderating. I'm here as the assistant director for the Center for Rural Education, but I have strong, long roots in Virginia, and especially in rural Virginia, growing up in Southside Virginia, Mecklenburg County, on a small farm, with a long history of teachers and educators in my family. And so, Lydia, I love how you kind of talked about how your access to archives is kind of through your history background, and mine is through a strong teaching background. And my grandmother, who was a teacher for 30 plus years in our community, knew every story. She, I think, was a walking archive of the town and the community. And so I think for me, that immediately instilled a lot of importance of archives and place-based knowledge and all of that to eventually lead me to become a middle school English and creative writing and theater teacher, which is all about, uplifting histories and stories, and especially with place centric in that. So I'm a little bit of a unique position, coming in here as an educator and teacher by trade, and it kind of has led into my position currently. Because what I do a lot now is I think about the role of archives and place narratives through the role of place-based pedagogy. So thinking about how place can inform teaching, how place can inform learning development, how place can inform literacy development, how place can inform how you see yourself in your youth world. And so I think a lot of my research that I do now, and I'll get to kind of some of the programs that get to implement this, are all about youth talent development. So having youth, especially from rural communities, see themselves as archivists, see themselves as place narrators, as purveyors of stories, as disruptors of monolithic stereotypes that often rural communities face, especially when we think about archival data and what gets kind of put into the urbanized places as archival space and archival research versus what rural communities might know as really important history that might not be as valued or undervalued. So now, in my position, we run a few different youth enrichment opportunities that are centered for rural youth across Virginia and a little bit in North Carolina. One of them is a summer enrichment program where we have youth from across rural communities come to Virginia Tech for a full residential experience, and they take courses. And a few of our courses are archival based. One of the courses this past summer was all about unlocking Virginia histories, and getting to work with stewardship and getting to work with stewards of the land at Virginia Tech and getting to know what those place histories look like through a Virginia Tech lens, but also how it impacts, the local Central Appalachian region, Central Southwest Virginia region, and so on. All of these camp experiences that we provide are all centrally placed in critical place-based pedagogies. So really getting our students to ask, who are the stories that are celebrated here? How are those stories celebrated here? Why did those stories get celebrated here? And how do you see yourself represented in these stories or your communities represented in these stories? And so I'm really excited because getting to listen to all of you is so inspiring already because it totally reinvigorates my work with, youth and getting to tell the untold stories of not only rural Virginia, but rural, Appalachia, rural United States, and then, the global rural itself. So I'm excited to be here. And that's kind of what my archival work looks like, which is what Lydia and Nix and Katie have already said, which is a lot of planning on the background, a lot of programming, thinking about how, my instructors are using place in their curriculum, thinking about how the youth are going to be engaged in it. One of the projects that the students do throughout the week, and we have a whole showcase, is they are the curators of their own places. And so whether that's through poetry, art, science, anything like that, they get to do a whole showcase, them getting to put themselves in place as a scholar. So that's kind of my work and what that looks like here.
Thanks so much, Clint. Yeah, the idea of educating young people as archivists and curators of stories is brilliant and incredible, and kind of leads into the next question that I'm hoping you all can address, which is the relationship between the archives or the programs that you're involved with and the larger community. You've already talked about, many of you, the audiences you serve or the communities that you're primarily working with, but where do you find that those relationships are most successful or engaging? In what instance or program or methodology?
I can jump in on this one
Please
first. As I mentioned a little bit, so much of the work of our history project was bringing community to the archives and vice versa. Since we are such a local project, I, for example, know personally a significant proportion of the folks we have done oral history interviews with. I see them walking around the neighborhood. We have dinner together. We're at the same events. having that kind of relationship to the people who have contributed to our archives, not just in oral histories, but also people who wrote the regional LGBT newsletters in the 70s and 80s, people who ran the organizations, who did the work, and having them still active in our communities, people who I run into at the bar on the weekend, makes the relationship incredibly personal, which I feel I am incredibly lucky to have. And that also motivates and emphasizes the kind of community work we have always striven to do. I think our relationship between archive and community is particularly successful when we can connect people personally to the history, whether it's introducing them to someone who has conducted an interview, one of our narrators, or including people on events that speak to them and also teach them a little bit about the history of the spaces and people they are around all the time. We've had an incredible amount of success with walking tours across 3 different neighborhoods of Roanoke. We have led a gay history bar crawl for 8 years in a row now. And the last several years, it's been 30, 40 people joining in on that event all the way through. We go to a place, we talk about the history of queer nightlife in Roanoke. We go to somewhere else, we talk a little bit more about the spaces that existed, whether visible or not, in that block of downtown. So being able to engage people with, these are the streets you walk every day. This is the history that you can't see there, but it exists, has been incredibly fun. And that's always been a key. Even when there's incredibly tragic events or history in a place, like Roanoke's drop-in center that did a lot of the HIV/AIDS testing and advocacy in the 80s, whether it's Front Row, formerly Backstreet, that was the location of, at the time in the year 2000, what was the largest anti-gay mass shooting in the United States, where gay people still go and drink today. The level of personal connection makes it so that I meet people and then they know things about their neighborhood because other people are excited to share them. This is, I think, been it's been the key to public history in Roanoke. And we've been lucky enough that this has inspired some other groups. I run a Sapphic event group, Second Friday, that's actually named after a lesbian group in Roanoke from the 1980s, the Lesbians of First Friday. And so people knowing their history has directly inspired them to create community groups that are active now based on things that existed decades ago.
Excellent. Thank you. Clint, in the work that you do with young people, have you found similar themes of personal connection, creating engagement and projects out of the stories that folks are finding within their own families or communities?
Absolutely. And Katie and I, we have adjacent communities down here in Southwest Virginia, and so we've gotten to kind of cross each other's pathways quite a few times. And what I always have loved about our work and what I've been hearing tonight even too is like the work we do is it's by our people for our people. And a lot of our instructors are, from rural communities. They are those rural experts who, might not have seen how a rural poet from, Mecklenburg County could ever see themselves as a published author, or, a farmer who could never see themselves as a, soil scientist and things like that, that I think are so important. And that's what makes camp so special. That what makes these youth enrichment opportunities so special is it's because these it's these communities of people who want to come back and tell the stories of our place, who are so invested, not just in making sure that people know, but making sure the youth know of what the place looks like and how to kind of instill to the next generation of how to become local place experts and not to kind of, move away and forget about where you're from, but know that there's value wherever you go and, where you're from. And I have a couple of examples, when our students came our first summer camp to Virginia Tech, and they got to listen to Nikki Giovanni, who is a local legend in the Blacksburg New River Valley. And um, I've I've tried for many of years to keep a bunch of middle schoolers to just listen to poetry for an hour and a half. Um, Nikki Giovanni, hands above anybody else, can keep a room full of middle schoolers engaged like no other. And what was so powerful about those moments is, as Nikki was, talking about her place, talking about her history in such a candorous way as Nikki does. The kids who saw her as this local legend, who probably didn't know her. We only had a few kids that really knew a lot of her work from where they were from, but saw this person who had such passion, who had such, power when it came to their place and when it came to their identity. And we did this at a couple of other spaces as well. We featured Ricky Cox, who is a local Appalachian musician down here, who started the Appalachian Studies program at Radford, and he is, an icon and a legend down here. And he also captivated a room. George Ella Lyon has come to our camp to do a poetry workshop. Dan Wingate, who is a local leather expert, who kind of talks about leather as an Appalachian, as a rural practice, and what leather work means to our communities. And I'll tell you what, it's kind of what Katie was saying. Those moments, those community connections are what makes everything that we do like so successful with the young kids, because it is just the immediate buy-in, because it seems like wherever they're from matters.
Thank you so much, Clint. And then, so Nix, you're doing this, highly personal story work on a national level. So can you describe kind of what community looks like at that scale?
Sure. Something that I think about a lot, especially as an interviewer, is the national story is not one story. It is an amalgamation of many, 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 many different stories and many, 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 many different communities. And so I think as someone who was born and raised in New Orleans, who has very strong like Southern roots, I always bring my Southernness to my role as an interviewer and as an archivist. Um, but also, I think we're always looking for ways to support people who are from the place doing the work. And so something that we think about when we're doing grant work or when we're like looking for funding is also looking for opportunities to, instead of interviewing like one person from that place, like thinking about ways in which we can interview like a cohort of people, which is what kind of came up in the Virginia grant, like having the opportunity to interview four people from Virginia. We also interviewed four people from West Virginia. And having the ability to do those shoots just create a completely different dynamic for us in kind of like, again, that cross-pollination of experience, of place, of regionality, all of these things that are really important to capture. Um, and so when I think about what we're doing on a national scale, I think, yes, like while on the one hand, it's like, yeah, we want to capture a story from every single state in the country, which we're very close. We're at like 40 something now. So I'm very excited about that. But it's also thinking about, we have really big centers of what we think about as LGBTQ history, like New York, LA. Um, so when we think about the places that are represented most as LGBTQ history, we also have to think about the places that are represented least as LGBTQ history, especially like Southern history, rural history, and those places in the country that don't have as much of kind of like the clout as being an LGBTQ place. Something that I also really think about a lot as someone who is of African descent is how often people from immigrant communities express to us that their sexuality, their gender identity, all of their connection to the LGBTQ community is seen as like being Americanized. Americanized being like a negative connotation, right? And so I also think about that a lot where I'm just like, we're also thinking about how can we create stories where people talk about their connections to culture and to the countries that they came from, the communities that they came from, and balance those two identities in a way where it becomes increasingly obvious that all of these things can exist not only within one person, but like together, right? So I think when we're thinking about a national story, it's complicated by all of these pieces of knowing that we have interviewees who like we're not born as Americans, right? Like we have interviewees who were born in places that are not seen as, the centers of LGBTQ history. We have interviewees who um, who came out very late in life, like 50s, 60s, 70s, even 80s, right? So all of these people who have unconventional LGBTQ stories are the people that I think end up making our archive really, really dynamic, because there's this assumption that you have to come out at 15 or 20 or like very early in your life. There's this assumption that like the American story is told by these really big cities and not by rural places. There are many, many assumptions about like what the LGBTQ community is. And I think the more that we have opportunity to break through those assumptions and create stories around people who very much show that those assumptions are not the case for every single person in the LGBTQ community, the more that we have the opportunity to really bring more people in. I think something that we constantly think about as an organization and constantly think about just as staff is like, who isn't here, right? Like, who isn't having their story told, who's afraid to come out, who feels, like overwhelmed in our current political moment, especially. And how can we create opportunities for them to connect to someone who would be exactly like them, who has very similar stories to them, and can show them that the way that they are is perfect, right? And so I think when we're thinking about telling a national story, it's by telling all of these smaller stories that add up to a national story. I don't think that we go in with the assumption that like there's one American history. I think we go into our interviews with the assumption that LGBTQ history is American history, but there are many LGBTQ histories and there are many American histories. And so we're really trying to do that work of, I think, reasserting that LGBTQ history is like not only part of the American story, but is like the bedrock of the American story. Um, and the last piece that I'll leave is just like something I think about a lot is like the LGBTQ community like is the most diverse marginalized group because it touches every single marginalized group that exists, right? And so when I think about that, I'm like, okay, obviously there's going to be a very complicated, a very diverse story here, and we need to do what we can to touch on all of the pieces that we can.
That's excellent, Nix. Thank you. And you touched on a few things that I want to circle back to in our next question. But before we get there, Lydia, your work obviously focusing on pre-Civil War records. So I'd imagine community means something pretty different from the rest of the panelists. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, for sure. But I actually really love Nix's answer because I think it kind of speaks to what I think a challenge is for this project, but certainly what I want to accomplish in the fact that, Nix was saying LGBTQ history is American history. Well, I think of it as Black history as American history. And just to back up, because I don't think I said this, but Virginia Untold's primary goal is to make records around Black history at LVA accessible through digitization. So we are focused on, solely records that mention enslaved and free people of color so that that information is findable primarily for what we assume to be the Black community, right? People that are looking for their ancestors in these records. You think of them as descendants, but maybe they also are people that are just trying to do more research around Black history. And so, I have to make it clear, if it's not obvious, I am not from the Black community. And so I have to constantly be educating myself and in a place where I'm allowing people to educate me about Black history. And so when it comes to community, I feel like the most successful maybe scenarios have been when I have just placed myself in a place where I can listen and learn from Black scholars or Black genealogists, and they are seeing me at these events again and again and recognizing that they can maybe share information with me. Now, that did not happen overnight, and that's what I'm constantly learning, is that I actually had some Black colleagues who suggested that I just go to events and show up. I don't talk about my project. I don't hand things out. I don't come with an elevator pitch. I just sit and listen again and go to the event multiple times, right? And now, over 4 years, I'm starting to see finally that some of these people are finally feeling like they can actually communicate with me about records they may want to see online, because that's my ultimate goal, right? Is to form relationships so that I can hear what their needs are as Black genealogists and say, okay, are we addressing those records here at the library? Where are people doing research? Can we digitize those collections? But that took a really long time. I do want to mention too that I feel like one of the most successful maybe programs we've had at the library has been our transcription program. So we crowdsource the transcription of a lot of our records in Virginia Untold. And we have really sort of amassed all sorts of people. Some of them are Black genealogists, some of them are students, some of them are white genealogists, right? So when I think about community, it looks really big and really broad. It's not just who maybe I had in mind. It's also people that look like me that might also be searching this information or interacting with it for the first time. So that's something else I have to consider, is my audience is sometimes people that need that education, right? They are now learning that, oh, there were free Black people. There were people of color. Whereas my Black genealogists are like, yeah, duh, we knew that. We've known that. So it's a challenge. But I'm really sort of proud of the transcription work, because I feel like that gives, and I have to sort of tip my hat to my colleagues at LVA, because that was something that came before me and I was able to just jump in on, but it gives people a way to contribute to the work too. So they're actually doing transcription, or maybe they're doing some indexing, and then also able to provide feedback and be involved in maybe a conversation or a group discussion about what they're seeing for the first time, and maybe able to contact me, talk about the records a little bit. So yeah, community is not easily defined, but I think I really appreciate what others were saying about sort of these larger American stories, right? Because that's the ultimate goal. I want people to know that Black history is a part of your history too, and we can all learn a lot of things from looking at these records.
Thank you, Lydia. What you said about the necessity of trust building in the communities that you serve, and then Nix, what you had said right before that about breaking through assumptions with unconventional stories, it makes me want to jump right to a question a little bit further down on my list. But we're obviously all working with different types of underrepresented communities. And so can you all speak to how you've confronted instances of institutional biases or systems that really weren't designed to support minority voices or the voices of the communities that you're working with? And how has experiencing that, if you have, shaped your perspective and shaped your work? And I'll kick it over to Clint first because I'm interested in how this plays out when you are working with younger folks. Again, you don't often think of younger people as archivists or story collectors. So if you want to start, if you'd like.
Certainly. A couple of things. I'll start with actually maybe not the youth part, but with the book I co-edited, which Rural Education and Queer Identities, Rule and Not Rooted, which was a labor of institutional frustration when it came to Routledge, the publisher, like feeling like there was creative voices being worthy at the same level as research, right? And so I think when we think about uplifting, especially underrepresented communities, especially from higher academia, how have we kind of mitigated what is valuable, right? So often, a lot of times, creative voices have not been deemed as primary and is deemed as, worthy of, being distributed across, academia versus research, empirical research, which has been. And so partially, when it comes to underrepresented communities and the higher academia field, it's come to, how can we make sure that we're revaluing voice with research and how those things are so synonymous because they inform each other. As far as it coming to, institutional based systems and all of that, supporting minority voices, especially with our youth programming. I'm very fortunate at Virginia Tech because, especially with our rural youth program, we've had a ton of support. And partially, this program exists because there was an opportunity gap for rural learners, right? There are a lot of other spaces, a lot of other institutions that offer similar programs for youth enrichment, right? Oftentimes, those institutions might be in a central urbanized location, Richmond, DC. Oftentimes, they might come with a very hefty price tag to even be able to be a part of the experience. One of the questions later on is about funding. We've, up until this point, we've had grant funding to allow this camp experience to be free for our rural learners, and that has been incredibly important. And we've seen such such positive responses between families and communities, acknowledging how important that is as a resource because of those barrier opportunities when it comes to institutions who may be thinking about similar ideas and similar programs, but oftentimes are, location challenged or financially challenged. And I think a lot of times when we think about institutional biases and systems, those conversations don't often get talked about, especially for rural learners and folks from underrepresented communities, especially queer and trans communities.
Excellent. And because you've already mentioned the neighboring qualities of the work that the Southwest History, LGBTQ plus history project does, would you like to discuss that a little bit, Katie?
Certainly. Every time Clint and I run into each other, I'm so thankful that we are so close and our work overlaps because it's a joy. Regarding efforts focused on underrepresented communities, institutional bias, and systems, for us, it's interesting because this ties in also to discussions on funding. I mentioned earlier, we're completely volunteer-run, community-led initiative. We have never had a formal structure or formal funding sources. It has always been whoever shows up at one meeting gets to help make the decisions for what happens next. For a while, we did have some institutional ties to Roanoke College, but within the last couple of years of the project, fully divorced from Roanoke College to be fully sufficient and not dependent on any singular institution. We do have archives available through the Virginia library system. But in general, when it came to funding, etc., we would fundraise, like for printing a zine, we'd fundraise the printing costs on our own, or somebody would volunteer to buy a cake for an event. We were working on a very small scale, but no matter how small you scale things down, any group will replicate some of the biases and systems inherent in the larger society. For us, this was particularly evident when we first started collecting oral history interviews. The first round of narrators who volunteered, who were the most willing and eager to share their stories within the Roanoke LGBT community, were mostly white cis gay men. At that point, 2016-17, the History Project had not yet developed the relationships and the trust with queer women and lesbians, with Black queer people, with other queer people of color, with more rural groups, with disabled groups, to interest people and make them feel safe enough to come forward and share their stories. So the first collection of 10 to 15 interviews were mostly from a cis white gay male perspective. That was also the perspective on which the first walking tour of downtown Roanoke was based. The folks who were conducting the oral histories at the time immediately knew that this was a perspective that created a lot of blind spots, and there was work to be done to collect a bigger picture. Nix, I really enjoyed hearing what you were saying earlier about the trust building and the different perspectives, and how American history is many different things, and also it's everybody's story. Really resonated, and we have since then revised those tours multiple times to account for the additional perspectives that have been gathered. We have done rounds and waves of relationship building and community trust building in order to get to the point where people of various different perspectives were comfortable and willing to go on record and be oral history narrators and share their stories and their lives and their information with the History Project. Specifically, there were concerted efforts to get more women, more trans folks, more rural folks, more people of color, more Black women specifically. One of the few grants and funding sources that the History Project has pursued in its tenure was a grant in order to pay young women of color to train in conducting oral histories so that they could go and collect their own histories and not feel dependent on the History Project to do that work, but also they would be compensated for that training and the work that they did collect and share with the History Project. There's been a lot of work put in to counteract that initial effect of the first people who feel safe sharing their stories publicly like this are white men. And since that point, the History Project has focused on who are we missing? What gaps do we need to fill in our research? I think that is a pretty common.
Nix, I'm wondering if you've seen the white cis gay man effect in your work with Outwords.
Yeah, I was gonna say we definitely have had some similar experiences in terms of demographics. Um, I will say that it's taken some very intentional efforts from us as staff to really prioritize balancing out those demographics. So starting around 2020, we started making actual like demographic commitments to interviewing 50% people of color for all of our interviews. And now we're up to 60%. Um, I think in 2020, we're in 2025, so this must have been like 2023. We also made a commitment to do 50% of our interviews with trans, gender nonconforming, and intersex interviewees, also including two-spirit people who identify as part of that community. And so now there's this, I think, deeper conversation about kind of like the intersectionality between Um, because since we have to meet both of those commitments, there's now like a greater overlap of people of color who are trans or gender nonconforming or gender variant in some way. That's really important. Um, and so when I think about those commitments as an organization, they feel like deeply like unsexy, right? Like those are like not the fun conversations to have or like the fun things to have. But what has come out of it is really amazing. We've had really, really fascinating oral history interviews that get into, again, those really dynamic places around like how does gender identity like affect sexuality, affects regionality, affects all of these different things in ways that we weren't necessarily like capturing before. Um, and I think that also as an archivist who does the back end work, it's also how do we hold those stories, right? Like how do we bring them outward? How do we let people know that they exist? And how do we also um, hold these places of, I think, really deep pain and oppression and suffering that comes through in our more recent interviews um, in a way where we're not censoring those interviewees, but we're letting people know like these some of the stuff that you're talking about is really difficult. We're talking about conversion therapy. We're talking about, you know, racial oppression. We're talking about many different things that I could see us kind of touching on in the earlier interviews, but it was very much in a space of that person being a witness to something rather than being the person that it happened to. And now I think as we flip even more into a kind of like first person perspective, first person narrative, it's just more intense, right? Like there's just more detail, there's more um just there's just more, right? Like there's just more that comes through that interview. And so something that we've been working on as archivists is also like providing content warnings for some of our interviews, not to censor the interviewees by any means, but to let people know like, yeah, like these things are heavy. These things are really heavy to hold. And giving people the opportunity to kind of like opt out of certain parts of interviews or the interview entirely, kind of like depending on kind of like where they are with it. Um, I will say, as an archivist of color, I've seen some really terrible things in archives, to be entirely frank. So, I'm always going into my work with an understanding that people are going to have the same reaction that I have. Like, people are going to be emotionally impacted in the same ways that I am, if not even more, because they aren't necessarily like regularly going through archives and like knowing that like this is the water of what archives are. Right? Like I think I'm always aware of the fact that like I understand that like history is fraught and all of these things, and then people who aren't necessarily going through historical documents with the same like touch do not have that understanding that like these are the things that you would find in an archive, right? And so I'm always trying to create a space where people are allowed to tell their stories exactly as they want to tell them, while also kind of providing guardrails for people to understand like things are complicated, history is complicated. Um, I think one of the things that comes up, I think even more around around this sense of intersectionality that we've begun to kind of like seed through our demographic commitments is people don't agree with each other about what happened. Like people do not have the same perspective on things. Like people who are even in the same community at the same time, who have gone to the same places, have very different understandings of what those things mean. And I think the interesting place in archives, the dynamic place in archives, is letting everyone have their story and letting the audience have the ability to kind of see all the different perspectives and come to their own case around it. And so I'm always trying to move as an archivist with an understanding that like the more that we actually diversify our archive, like the more complicated it's going to get. And that's not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing to deal with the complications, but it's just the work that we have to do, to ensure that there's a level of truth or consistency across the board. Um, I think is what makes the work really interesting and really challenging sometimes.
Thank you, Nix. And when you talk about things that are heavy to hold, that's obviously inherent in the work, Lydia, that you're doing. So when you have these like painful and difficult topics, and you also have people who, through your public programming, might be encountering those for the first time or in a new way as they're actually looking at documents or logs. How do you talk about these topics? How do you introduce people? What is that process like for you?
Yeah, it's tough because sometimes I'm pretty far removed from who's accessing the records, right? So, sometimes in presentations, I have the opportunity to provide context with student groups or with genealogists, um, or, people that are just using the work. But a lot of the time, people are just coming across this. So, to the point about content warnings, that's something that the Library of Virginia provides as well as for some of this more sort of really hard to digest material or material that will be graphic in nature. Actually, anecdotally, I had this conversation with Marianne, who introduced us this evening. And at first we were like, well, we could put content warnings on everything in Virginia Untold, right? Because to some level, it's all very disturbing. But that would almost sort of dilute the intentionality of the content warning for some of the other materials. So we had to make a kind of tough call about where we were gonna sort of, introduce people to this kind of stuff. To the point about sort of institutional biases, I feel like the material within Virginia Untold, or maybe the sort of contextual problem at the Library of Virginia, is not so much that there are gaps in our record, but that these records are here, but we haven't done a very good job of talking about them. So it's very, or, doing anything about it. So it's striking this balance between sort of bringing it up and sharing it and making it a priority for this institution, but then also placing the right context and recognizing that there's some people, again, back to audiences, there's some people that really need to hear this for the first time because they haven't been introduced to this history. And then there's other people who feel like they have lived this history, right? Like maybe they're currently living this history or they have it in their generational trauma. So that's a real challenge there. And I think maybe the best thing we can do is recognize, I can recognize through Virginia Untold and sort of advocate that my institution recognizes the harm that we have done by not recognizing this history, by not prioritizing its description or its digitization, and recognizing that's the goal of Virginia Untold, right? We are now reckoning with the fact that we haven't talked about the people in these records well. We haven't focused on the names in those will documents or those deeds. And so now we are digitizing this work and making it keyword searchable so that we can, as a step towards helping people see that. And again, I mean, I think also to the point of being a little far removed, I'm just one player in this too. I see my work as facilitating that access, but hopefully I'm putting it in the hands of people that will talk about it better than I can. Like people on this call tonight, on this panel with me, that are actually working with the communities and are educators, like Clint working with students, right, that are able to now see the material and then have those really hard conversations on the ground level that maybe I couldn't. So hopefully I'm facilitating that, even in this more far removed position I feel like I'm in.
Thank you, Lydia. This has been a great conversation so far, and I know that we're trying to leave a little bit of room for Q&A before we wrap up. So just to finish the panel portion, you're all clearly very passionate about the work that you're doing, and I'm wondering if you can each just briefly talk about if there's a specific component or moment or activity that kind of brings you the most joy or fulfillment in your individual projects.
I can go. I think what gives me the most joy in this work is when an elder clearly has very little documentation of themselves online, and they're like, wow, this is like the first time someone has been really invested in my story, or like this is the first time that I've ever felt like I could be part of the historical record. I think those are the moments where I just feel very like grateful and humbled by the work, in giving people the opportunity to be seen and be connected to communities that are of value to them. Um, and I feel like it happens more and more lately, which is very, very intense. But I feel like that's my joy moment is giving our narrators like the opportunity to um, have a historical record when they never expected that to happen.
Thank you, Nix. Anyone else want to go?
I can hop onto the back of that one. And mine is kind of similar because I was honored to be able to be a part of the Outwords project and their histories down here in Southwest Virginia. And I have two answers now because of that project. I'm just kidding. My first one was always going to be it's the youth that get so excited to know that they can come to any place and be like, hey, I have all of this knowledge around my farm or my land or my community, and how that knowledge is so applicable to any type of future that they see themselves in, and to see their excitement. And then on the flip side, after this other project, which I have been completely changed for life, which is listening to queer and trans elders from, our community who, as a local activist and advocate who I feel like I have now so many lifetimes of inspiration. I don't just have one lifetime of inspiration, I have so many. And I think that that is the point of archival work is you can always go in there and listen to spaces and stories to give you inspiration when you really need it in certain times.
I can
Excellent.
go next. I personally love, and this is part of the reason why I got involved in the first place. I love feeling connected to the place I live in, to the people and the city and the land, and knowing the historical tradition that I am a part of myself. That means a lot to me. And I especially love watching that connection happen for other people. Whether it's elder lesbians in Roanoke hearing that we started Second Friday in honor of the lesbians of First Friday. It's always a lot of laughter. Or if it's people that I know who are my age or younger who think that they're in a small Appalachian city and they're gay and that makes them different and strange and there's no way that there's a history there that reflects them. And then learning that they are, in fact, a part of a long-standing tradition and are part of a very specific culture, and it's documented they have access to it, and watching them become more connected to our community. It is why I do all of this.
Thank you, Katie.
Yeah, kind of jumping on what Katie said in terms of watching people, watching it through someone else's eyes. I feel like the moments that I can watch someone discover something, like through the archives or through a research journey, just motivates me. And it reminds me back to those roots of like, this is why I love history. So sometimes in presentations, I'm in the middle of kind of explaining how I found someone, how I came to who, this identity point that I was trying to find. And you can collectively see the crowd be like, oh my gosh, that's what the record says. Or I'm emailing back and forth recently with a descendant who was able to find, I shared some just additional collections with her online that were outside of Virginia Untold. And she was emailing me play-by-plays, which I loved. I don't normally get that, but like every few days she would update me on the different things she found. And her emails were just full of emotion because you could feel that she was discovering this world where she might find her ancestor. And that's really neat because then I'm reminded, oh yeah, that's what we're doing, right? That's what we're unlocking something for people, which is, yeah, it keeps me coming back for sure.
Thank you. I think that's a great place to leave the panel portion of the conversation.